You're listening to Catholic Family Podcast. Episode 19.
Thanks very much for listening to today's show. I'm Kevin Davis, and I'm very happy to be joined by my wife, Ina Davis, from all the way over in our living room. Yeah, we actually can't do the show together technically because it sounds better doing it over Skype rather than with one microphone in my little office/studio. And so we are doing it across the house from each other, but we're going to do our best to do a show talking about Martin Luther and the Protestant Revolution, not the Protestant Reformation, the Protestant Revolution, and especially about a movie produced in 2017 by Gregor Braun, a Polish man. This movie is, I think, an hour and 20 minutes long, and it is positively brilliant in all things regarding Martin Luther and the evils that he has brought to this world. There are many things that I think the followers of Luther, the Lutherans, have plenty of good intentions. They want to do what's right. I think they're generally good-hearted people. In this show today, our intention is not to personally judge them. We are not experts. We are just two people who just recently watched a movie and want to talk about a very important topic. So we're not judging the people, we're judging the material of this religion, and especially who Martin Luther was himself. Many of what the things we'll talk about are actual quotes that come from Martin Luther himself, and I promise you will be absolutely astounded from some of them. Before we get farther, I want to recommend as highly as I possibly can that you watch this movie. If you have any doubts about Martin Luther or the Novus Ordo coming closer to the Protestant faith, consistently, if you have relatives who are Protestants, this is a movie that will really enlighten you and help you understand exactly who he was and what he did to the world in really a catastrophic degree. And we're still feeling the effects today, over 500 years later, or almost 500 years later. And so, Ina, do you have any comments before we begin, or should we just get going?
Yeah, I mean, it really is like you said. I think oftentimes our modern culture, it really turns Luther into anything they want him to be, like the founder of feminism, the founder of modern democracy. And it really is not in line with the real historical Luther. And it really, like you said, I mean, this movie, I think we were both blown away when we saw like his actual comments and what he said just himself. And yeah, I think it is really worth your time watching it. And yeah, let's get started.
All right. So Martin Luther was born in 1483 in Eisleben, Germany. I believe that's in the eastern part of Germany. So thank goodness for us, we don't live anywhere near where that all happened. We're fortunate to be in a very Catholic part of Germany, really the only true remaining Catholic part of Germany here in Bavaria, one that wasn't affected too much, at least negatively, by the revolution. He was born into an unfortunate circumstance. I think his father was decently wealthy, but the stories go that he was abused physically and I think mentally as well by both of his parents. So he did not find much love from either of his mother or his father. And I think you see that a lot coming out in the later years, and that he was a very hard person and not a pleasant person to deal with whatsoever. And so I think many Protestants believe that he was kind of this strong man. And then the story goes that he wandered into a monastery during a lightning storm and sought refuge there during a lightning storm. And in fact, that is not the case. That is just strictly made up. It is a made up story. The actual story is not quite so nice. And Ina, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit, to tell me a little bit about what happened. How did he end up in a monastery?
Okay. Well, so I guess at the time he dueled a lot with like friends and strangers, even though it was strictly against the law at the time. And it happened so he dueled one time and he got hurt really bad, and then he got taken care of by the woman that he lived with and that he had illegitimate children with. And often he was also characterized as a very short-tempered person and a womanizer, and he even often boasted about this himself. And so eventually he recovered. And despite this first warning, he was dueling again shortly after. And this time he actually killed his opponent, struck him with a wound that was fatal. And since it obviously was against the law, he was in a difficult situation. So he was actually studying law in Erfurt, not theology as some people might think. And so because making use of his knowledge of law and his monastic right of asylum, he hid in a monastery. And so his friends would approach him and write him letters. So, you have no vocation, you are a lawyer. And what shall we do with your woman and your bastards? And Luther would actually reply to him that he cannot leave the monastery because they would cut his head off. And he said, and this is a quote, that he has to stick to this damn monastic cloak.
Yeah, it's brutal. And before we get going, I should have warned everyone at the beginning that some of his direct quotes are really, really explicit. I mean, and Ian and I both don't like using harsh language, obviously, and anyone listening, maybe this isn't really a good one for kids anyway, but it is some explicit language, but we did want to get the idea of exactly the quotes from Martin Luther. This is his own writing, and we wanted people to get the idea of who this guy was. And I think if you take out some of the language, you don't get exactly the same feel for this man. He was a very rough person, and you see, as Ina said, that he was not in the monastery because he thought he had a vocation. Really, exactly the opposite. I don't think he ever felt like he had a vocation. He from the very beginning, he actually had kind of a disdain for the priesthood and for the sacraments, and he had this massive issue with his conscience. And I know in this show, in the movie Luther and the Protestant Revolution, they mentioned that he would have 30 or so sacramental confessions a day. So he was clearly someone who was absolutely troubled. His mind was troubled, and I think probably had a lot to do with how he was raised. Unfortunately, that's a really tragic part to the story, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they actually say that his father, he was so brutal that at one time he killed their own farm help because he was punishing him. And it just shows, you feel really sorry, obviously, for any child to grow up that way, but it really shows it explains a certain brutality that marks a lot of Luther's undertakings, which we will see as we go on and describe more of his life.
Right. And so after he had been in the monastery for a bit, he did actually become a priest. He took the holy orders, which obviously in hindsight, that's a bit questionable, but he did progress that far that he did become a priest. But he is even quoted to have said things against the Mass and against the words of transubstantiation. And he really questioned the whole thing and had major doubts, not just about himself, but about the Catholic religion. And this is very early on. And you can tell that this was a very troubled person, that he was not doing anything for the love of God or even, to try to further any good in the world. He was just trying to make his way, and I think trying to find his own truth, which I think you and I would both agree is a very, very modern idea.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
And so I guess the next big step after he had become a priest, the famous story goes supposedly that he had his aha moment while sitting on the toilet, while sitting on the latrine. And this is one of the tenets, the primary tenets of the entire revolution and why he left the Catholic Church. And Ina, maybe you wanted to describe what exactly that was. What did he discover while sitting on the toilet?
Well, I think also because, he was Luther, he wanted a guarantee that he was saved, which obviously we cannot have while we are still on this earth. And he eventually came to the conclusion that man is incapable of pleasing God after his fall and after the original sin. And I think because of this incapability, it was a convenient theory to justify his human shortcomings. And he came to the conclusion that because I think he had read the Bible and he read something about that it is good to live for the sake of faith alone. And he kind of interpreted in the way that faith alone is enough. It's not good works and good deeds or faith formed by love, and that God's moral law can, with His help, be observed. It's just enough if we have faith.
And it's a typical issue with many of people that are not Catholics. They go to the Bible and they take out select lines from the Bible and say, okay, this is what I want from it. That this is enough. I'm not going to read the rest of the Bible. I'm just going to read this one line because it works. And sometimes even to say, I'm going to read this one part of a line and skip out the rest. And so clearly, if you read the Bible, if you read Christ's teachings, you obviously have to behave. You have to be a good person. You have to act with charity towards your brother and your neighbors. And that's an extremely obvious point, which I really don't quite understand how people can kind of get confused with that. But with Luther, right, his whole idea was he wanted a way to get out of always feeling guilty. I think he had this guilty conscience, and he didn't want to feel that way anymore. And so he found a way to say, okay, yep, it is just faith alone, and it says so in the Bible. And so I believe it was in 1517. So this was a few years, I think, after he was ordained a priest. 1517, he nailed the famous theses to the wall in, I think it's in Erfurt, Germany, if I remember correctly, which again I believe is also again in Eastern Germany now. And obviously this caused a big stink. We don't really know how literal that was, if he actually nailed it to the door. There's probably some truth to it, but he put out this idea and really this strong argument against the Catholic Church. And after this, the Catholic Church, the church, we should say, and they actually talked about this in the movie as well, that the Catholic Church at the time was also a bit of a mess. It was not being run properly. There were a lot of issues from the top down. You had the Medici popes in charge at the time and for the last decades, and they were really not good popes. They were not heretical popes, but they were very immoral popes. And for example, they knocked down the 1500-year-old St. Peter's to build a new one. Now, the new one that I think you and I have seen is beautiful and it's magnificent, but it's also, it kind of showed that they were progressing. They wanted to progress from tradition and move on from the past. There was also problems with selling indulgences. Thank you. Selling indulgences. And there were scandals in the Catholic Church at the time. And I think that is partly why Luther was able to get away with a bit of his complaining, because at first it didn't actually really get much of a pushback from the Catholic Church, because the Pope just thought, okay, this is just going to all kind of fade away. It's an issue with the monks amongst each other. And obviously as the time went on, I think the Vatican started to realize this is a big deal. Right,
that's right. And he thought that Catholicism itself laid too heavy a burden on the contemporary man. And so, for example, he actually, his original name was Luder, his last name, and he actually went himself and he changed it first to Eleutherius, which is Greek for liberator, and eventually changed it to Luther. And I mean, this really shows his idea and the whole liberator thing. It is almost like a humanist approach.
Right, exactly. And he wanted to, quote unquote, unchain people and souls from the Catholic Church, because he thought that, like you said, it was too harsh, it was too hard, and that he thought that they were becoming too much of a worldly power, I suppose, even though, as we will see as he went on, that was exactly the opposite. So after these theses, eventually a cardinal called, I believe it is Cardinal Cajetan, actually stopped by. He wasn't actually even sent. It was kind of a side mission. He was actually in Germany and around Europe trying to make money for a crusade, or at least to help take money to help defeat the Muslims in the East. And while on his way, he went and met with Martin Luther. They had many arguments and discussions, and you can actually go back and read those transcripts, which I think would be pretty incredible. And apparently, if you read the transcripts, Martin Luther was very angry and nasty, while Cardinal Cajetan was very patient and calm. And they actually met for 3 different days, and Cardinal Cajetan was very trying to bring him back and trying to give him every chance he could to repent of his heresies. And of course, Martin Luther did not, and the papacy was forced fairly soon after to excommunicate Martin Luther. And Luther then said,
Yeah, so he went ahead and he said, before he defined the Pope as an antichrist, and he just wrote a bull in which he stated, well, before you excommunicate me, I will excommunicate you.
Right. And so he kind of threw it back in the Pope's face and saying, well, since I don't see you as a true authority anyway, it doesn't really matter. And so Luther set himself up as the head of a new church. Now, in this film, which again I highly recommend, it's called Luther and the Protestant Revolution by a man named Gregor Braun from Poland. I highly recommend people find. You can find it on Vimeo. You have to pay €4 in order to watch, but it's absolutely brilliantly done and very captivating. They have a lot of images and stuff that make it very easy to recognize what's going on. And they have people from all over the world, experts who've studied Luther with really, really great testimony to what he was. Now, during this time, you wonder why. How could this man? He was just a simple priest who had some ideas that went against the Catholic faith, and then he was excommunicated. So, how did he actually find any traction? How did he actually create this revolution? And it's a pretty difficult topic, but simply enough, there were several things that really worked in his favor. And one of them was the printing press, which had recently been created for the first time so that people could really print at a mass amount and spread flyers and all sorts of different teachings from Martin Luther. And that was a big advantage that he had that others in the past did not have. Now, the other one was that, unfortunately, many of the princes and kings, especially in Germany, but really all around Europe, were really immoral people who were desperate for more money, and many of them were bankrupt. And there was a big issue with people wanting more of the time, I guess. And I guess that, again, that's kind of a modernist approach, which you can see in that time. And so you can see that how he gained traction was by going and siding with these princes and kings and telling them that, hey, you know what? If you follow me, you don't need the Catholic Church in your country anymore, or in your state, or in your city. And so the kings thought, hey, this is a great idea. I don't really care anyway. This sounds like a lot easier religion, and we can go and take all of the Catholic Church's holdings. So their churches, their monasteries, their convents, their land, which was a lot. They held a lot. They were a very rich, not an organization, I guess, but they had a lot throughout all of Europe. And so you can see the motivation that the kings and princes had in order to follow Luther rather than the Catholic Church.
Right. That's right. And so I think for a lot of princes, since they could take over all this wealth, sadly, often it just was a convenient thing to become converted and to seize the church of all its property and its monastery and its farms. And Luther actively called the monasteries to be deserted, and there were lots of nuns that renounced their vows and left and got married. And yeah, it really was a sad and terrible time.
Yeah, and I think the things that many people don't know is that Luther was directly behind a lot of these revolutions, not spiritual revolutions, but actual physical revolutions that were going on. The people rising up against the nobility and the knights rising up against the kings. And he was kind of always stoking the fire. And somehow he always got away from being punished for it. So he would go on the side of the rebellers the rebels. I got to find the right word here, the rebels. And then he would just kind of switch sides immediately when he knew that the rebels were going to lose, because he didn't want to get his head cut off. And so he always kind of played this kind of hot potato with both sides. And really, you started to see absolute chaos all over Europe. Rome was burnt. You saw, all over England, Norway, Sweden, Germany, they were all starting to become these battlegrounds for monarchs who wanted more power and who wanted to destroy the Catholic Church, and primarily because they just wanted more money. I don't think it was even an ideology for many of these princes and kings. They mostly just wanted more, which is again kind of horribly sad.
Yes, and then you have the Peasants Revolt in 1524 and 25, which was also, a revolt against authority. And in that revolt, that was based on Luther's kind of free thinking. The interesting thing is he actually himself called for a military intervention, and he was very harsh on the peasants, and he called for them to be hanged, tortured on a raking wheel, or subject to other cruel punishments.
Right. So that's a direct quote from Luther that can be found in his writings. He was a brutal man, and he just simply wanted what was best for him. He didn't, at this point, he was all in it for his own ease, and I suppose trying to spread his crazy beliefs. I think he must have had some sort of power trip, I suppose. And he said, I think along that same line, he was quoted to say, quote, "I killed all the peasants during the rebellion. Their blood is upon my head, but I put it all on the Lord my God, who commanded me to speak like that." Which is pretty incredible. I think that brings us directly to another extremely important point about who Luther was and what he was trying to create with his new religion.
Right. And really what he himself regarded as his most important work, which was called On the Bondage of the Will. And it pretty much says that man is not free in his relation to God. And it also becomes pretty clear that the whole the matter of indulgences, it was but a pretext, because it would have been enough to simply not donate any money anymore, and the issue would have been solved. And for example, this is also really interesting. In one of his 95 theses, he actually writes, "Wrong are those who think the Pope has no authority to grant indulgences." But no one really reads Martin Luther these days anymore.
Right.
And it's really interesting. He writes to a friend, Erasmus of Rotterdam. He writes to him, "Well, you were the only one who understood me properly, It was never about indulgence trading, purgatory, or the papacy. What was my primary consideration was the bondage of the will." And this really is like Luther's philosophy and theology. And his conclusion is, it is not a poor man who is guilty, but an unjust God who made Adam fall and who made Judas betray him. And that he is the creator of both good and evil. And he goes even farther than that. Do you want to go on?
Yeah, right. And so and this is a direct quote from Luther. He says, quote, "It was God who put Christ to death in heaven and in front of our eyes at Golgotha." And so, again, he is
a God who is a tyrant.
Exactly. He is directly saying that God is evil and I guess also sometimes good. And so Luther, again, you see his entire motivation is to take away any will from himself. He does not want to be the one who suffers from a bad conscience. He doesn't want it ever to be his fault for doing something that is wrong, even though obviously we all have that conscience and we all have that inner code that tells us what we should and should not do. And he admits that, but he says that, well, I am a sinner and God made me this way. And so what should I do? So of course I will sin. So his famous line that I think everyone knows is to be a sinner and sin boldly, but to believe more boldly. And so another quote that he said, and this is a direct quote from Martin Luther, he says, God destines one man for hell, irrespective of the good he does, and he destines another man for heaven, irrespective of the evil he does. So he believed directly in
predetermination.
Thank you. My German wife has the words better than I do, which is this is not something new. I just cannot think of anything today. But yeah, but it's a honestly pretty incredible text that you're seeing, that this is a man who clearly hated God. I mean, really hated God. I think he had no love of. I mean, there are even crazier ones. Go ahead and read the next one if you want. There's a one that they quoted in the movie in German, so you can do German much better than I can, and then maybe translate it for us as well.
Right. Yeah. So he said, because of his whole thinking that God is evil, he said, Gott kann nicht Gott sein, muss zuerst der Teufel werden, which means God cannot be God. He has to become the devil first.
Crazy. Yeah. It's you just see again, he's throwing everything to God's feet and blaming everything on him that Luther and his followers do. It takes away any semblance of responsibility or duty for the person, which is fantastic, I suppose, if you just want to go and have a good time and drink and party and steal women from convents, which he did.
Right.
He stole his wife from a convent and said, what did he say?
Yeah, that's right. And as you can see, his whole philosophy, it affected priestly, marital, and property rights. And that's why they also speak of more of a revolution than it really was just a reformation. And yeah, so he said, just as Christ redeemed us at Easter, I redeemed Katharina Barbora when I abducted her from her convent and made her my wife.
Which is obviously totally insane. That's a quote, okay? So if anyone's doubting this up until now, how weird and creepy a man he was, you got to start digging into this. And I know I'm not sure we're going to have any Protestants reading this, or listening to this, I should say. But if they are, I mean, look into this yourself. Look at his actual writings and stuff. These are actual quotes from Luther. We're not making this up. We're not just trying to trash him. We're not trying to trash Protestants. This is directly from him. This is what happened. And if you know this stuff, I certainly hope you start questioning your religion. And at their wedding, now this is pretty incredible. This shows you the state of their friends, I suppose, or who they were as people. At their wedding, over 20 people were killed at their wedding in a brawl. I mean, it's absolutely insane. I mean, the farther this movie goes,
cannot imagine it. It's kind of like, okay, this is like a history line we read, but when we actually picture a wedding of one of our friends and imagine what has to happen, that how many people get into a fight, and even just if one person was killed, how crazy would that be? I've never heard of a wedding, where someone was killed, and 20 people. I mean, you almost cannot believe it. And I also wanted to say there's this scene in the movie where there's this lovely old lady who's been interviewed, and she said that, her family used to be Protestant for, I think, several generations. And eventually she was like, yeah, well, I want to know the faith better. I actually want to know what this great Dr. Martin Luther said. And she began to study his writings. Or I think it might have even been her grandmother. And pretty much upon reading Martin Luther, she said, this is insanity. I have to become a Catholic at once.
Right, exactly. I mean, and I think, again, you see that if you know the person, then you would not follow the religion that he founded. And if you go back to the wedding and the 20 people dead, I think you see clearly that they changed morality. They actually changed what you could and could not do, because before this time, there was a certain standard that you could get away with. I mean, obviously, the Catholic Church has many rules, which people give it a hard time for, but that's ridiculous, because as a society, even, we have to have rules, or we will have chaos. We'll have anarchy. And when you have a wedding that has 20 deaths, you clearly see this chaos and anarchy. And you see, this is what they brought. They brought this destruction and evil. And maybe you don't see that now because this is all 500 years ago, but the beginning of this religion was really deeply, deeply evil. Look at in England, where King Henry VIII founded his own church, really on the basis of Protestantism. And he did so simply because he wanted to marry another woman. Once he married the other woman, he had her head cut off. And he ended up having, I believe, 6 wives. So this is King Henry VIII. And so that whole entire religion of Anglicanism was founded on blood and murder. All right. Sorry if we had a little bit of an awkward pause. Sophia, our daughter, did just wake up. So we had to go run and get her, but we're back now. So yeah, back to talking, of course, about Martin Luther and specifically the movie Martin Luther and the Protestant Revolution made by Gregor Braun, a Polish man, very highly recommendable. I will attach the link to that movie in the show notes. Definitely go and watch the movie. I cannot recommend it highly enough if you have any questions or have family members who are Protestants. And I think we've really covered a lot his own immorality and how his entire religion was based on loosening rules and letting men kind of make their own rules. And he also did that with the sacrament of marriage. As we said, he went and stole his wife from a convent and said that, well, it's kind of his right because he's pretty much God. And he also, what else did he say about marriage,
Well, he approached the emperor and he wanted him to have marriage to be just a marital contract and like pretty much an earthly thing and not a sacramental institution. And so this pretty much opens the door for divorce as well. And as we know, Protestants can get divorced. And he was also pretty strict on some things, like he advocates for the death penalty for a woman who commits adultery. And so you wonder, what about the man? Should he have the death penalty as well? And I guess no, just a light punishment for a man.
Right. And he was quoted, and this is sensitive. This is adult material. So again, if kids are listening, go ahead and pause this and listen to it later. But this is a quote from Martin Luther. He says, quote, "Indeed, if Katharina Barbara refuses to comply, let the maid come, since I can't free myself from this luxury. After all, I received this nature from God." In other words, if he cannot sleep with his wife or she does not want to, then go ahead and bring in another woman because, well, God made him to want that. And what can he do? And again,
a man doesn't have to try to be more perfect.
Exactly. And it shows again this whole issue of, well, it's all good. You just have to believe. You just have to trust that it's all going to be okay. It doesn't matter how you act, which is, of course, it's directly against Christ's teachings. It's directly against what Christ said. Christ said many times, and he said, they asked him, what are the two main commandments? And he said, love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart, mind, and soul, and thy neighbor. Now, if that's the case, what does that mean? If you love a neighbor, can you just do whatever you want? Can you have 20 people killed at a wedding? Can you sleep with other people when when you're married? I mean, clearly this is against the teachings of Christ. You don't even have to bring in the Catholic Church. And this is, again, one of the major issues with Protestants is they go to the Bible as the only way to follow Christ. It's sola scriptura. They believe that that's the only way to reach heaven, to follow the Bible, which of course is ridiculous because, Ina, who composed the Bible?
Right, the Catholic Church. Yeah, and the question always is, of course, who interprets it? And it was the Church who gave birth to the Bible, not the other way around. And I think, as they say, it wasn't even until the 5th century until it was the 73 books of sacred scripture that were agreed upon, and of which, by the way, Luther conveniently threw 6 out and so shrunk it by about 10% if you look at the number of books. And bits and pieces here and there. For example, take St. John, who says, faith without deeds is dead.
I think that was St. James. Was that St. John? I think that was St. James.
All right, that might have been St. James.
Well, one of the two, yeah. One of the two.
Brother,
but yeah, right. Faith, yeah, one of the two brothers, exactly. The sons of thunder. Faith without deeds is dead. Exactly. And come on, we don't need one line from the Bible. Sure, he shouldn't take out parts of the Bible, but if you go and read the Bible, or it's really clear that Christ wants people to also act well. I mean, look at how he speaks with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and says, you hypocrites, you brood of vipers. He's telling them all the bad things they've done and that they will not reach eternity because they've done them. Christ doesn't say anything to them about, well, if you have faith enough, then you'll get to heaven. I mean, it's doctrine and theology that's based, honestly, it's based on a few lines in the Bible, not the Bible itself. Now, that being said, as we said at the beginning of the show, I think there are many very good, kind-hearted Protestants. I've known several, and I'm sure you've known several as well. So it's not, again, calling into the evil heart of these people, but we want to show anyone listening that this religion that you're in was founded by a disgusting, despicable human being. And all of the entire religion is called Protestantism. It is directly to protest the Catholic faith, which of course is ridiculous. I mean, if you're in a religion, shouldn't it be because it's the truth?
That's right. Right. And I mean, Luther also goes on, for example, in Romans, that he even inserted a word in the Bible, like the word alone. And he said, we are justified by faith alone, which was even too much for some of his followers. And so it wasn't contained in the later versions, but his original German Bible had it, and it's kind of very reflective of his attitude. And he almost like put himself in the place of his so much despised Pope. And he's quoted too, like that he would tell others like that had questions or inquiries. He's like, tell them Dr. Luther said so. And so even though his whole protest was really against authority, and he kind of puts himself in that place, which is really contradictory. And I mean, and you have to say too that one of the reasons why his Bible was so successful and stuff, and I think this is an interesting historical fact to know, is because that he translated the New Testament into the clerical Saxon dialect of the time and made it widely available. So I think in a way he was really lucky that it was all around the time that the printing press was invented, and obviously was a moneymaker for them. And because of this new dialect that you could suddenly get the Bible, there was a sense of novelty among the people, and that could suddenly have their own Bible. And I think that's also interesting that really led and helped spread Protestantism. Like, it couldn't have happened in the 3rd century or 5th century because there wasn't a printing press, for example.
Right. And as you see this spread all over Europe, the people were really pretty slow in accepting the actual changes. And there were rebellions against the rebellion, I suppose. And the people did rise up in several places, and the Catholics fought against the Protestants. And there was war for 50 or 100 years throughout Europe. And this was against, from monarch to monarch and, peasant to peasant, trying to set an ideal, I suppose. But I think that was even less of it. I think it was, you had monarchs trying to take advantage of the situation. They saw that the power that had been the Catholic Church was really getting kicked in the shins and really suffering at the moment. And so they really took advantage of that to really get more wealthy and get more land and stuff. Right. And you see that the entire revolution, that the entire religion was spread simply through greed, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you see in this whole, the entire power to the princes, of course, this was unjust, and so it led to a civil war. And there were really brutal methods used against those who refused to leave their monasteries, for example. And Luther himself said too, it's better to murder all bishops and uproot all monasteries than to allow one soul to perish.
Crazy, right. And it just shows that as long as his will was done, then it's fine. And you just see he's setting his own morals, and he's setting, whatever he wanted it to be, that there was no moral guidance. And I see that in a lot of religions today, that it follow your own conscience. It doesn't matter as long as you do what you think is best. And that's absurd. It's absurd. I mean, if you look at society, look at people, our wills, our nature is automatically not bad, I suppose, but it is not, our nature is not to strive for the good. That is since the fall of man in original sin. We have to work for good. We have to work for eternity. We can't just naturally end up that way. And if you believe so, as Jordan Peterson would say, then you are actually insane. And so I think that that's a big part of it, that the Catholic Church does give a guideline and moral rules, and sometimes it's hard. But what's our goal? Is our goal to drink 7 liters of sweet wine per day to stay in a good mood, which is actually a quote from Luther? Yes, again, 7 liters of sweet wine a day so that his mood does not leave him. That's directly from Luther. And so is that what we want? Do we want to have this freedom to sin and do whatever it is that we want to do? Of course not, if we actually want to get to heaven. We should all know that to get to heaven, we have to suffer a little bit, and we have to be like Christ, who suffered and died for us to get to heaven.
Right. And you say, yeah, and like you said, you kind of just have your conscience as the ultimate moral, authority. I mean, God gave us our consciences as a moral guide, but we have to keep in mind that they can be corrupted. And just because one man says, well, it doesn't go against my conscience if I kill this elderly person, I'm actually doing them good. This doesn't make it a good deed, because there is such a thing as absolute morality.
Exactly. And in this movie, again, they give examples of the decline of society shortly after this revolution. And you see that many things, even in science, technology, engineering, were lost for hundreds of years, primarily because a lot of this came from the Catholic Church and from monks and from these people who are trying to learn for the good of all, and especially for the glory of God. And when you lose that, when you stop trying to learn for the glory of God and stop trying to progress only for our own salvation and for the glory of God, then eventually it all leads to the devil. And we've seen that. We've seen exactly what, unfortunately, the Protestant church has led to. I mean, it was taken up. Luther was taken as a prime example or one of these guides for the Nazis in Germany. The Nazis looked at Luther by the end. And this is, again, something they say in the show. In the Nuremberg trials, you had several of the worst Nazis saying, well, I mean, what do you expect? We were just doing what Luther told us, because Luther, by the end of his days, was very, very anti-Semitic and very against the Jews. And I think there was a quote against the Jews. Was there not?
Yes, there was, yeah.
Right. It said, yeah, I say it. So it said, quote, "It is advisable to burn all synagogues to the ground, have their houses destroyed, to have the young men and women alike to earn their bread by the sweat of their brows." So that is our lovely Martin Luther.
Yeah, yeah. But he's still really looked upon as a hero all days. And yeah, and I mean, you said it before too, with the decline of civilization a little bit around that time historically, and I think you also have to see that it really was like a beautiful Europe before, like a beautiful, like there was this one Europe and one faith that held it all together. Even though there were lots of different customs and different states and languages, and then you see. On the other side, the Protestant camp was extremely divided, even from the very beginning. And it wasn't really like that kind of enriching dialogue. But it wasn't. And while it was expanding, it was dividing as mad, and everyone was quarreling with each other, and the Catholics. And you had Zwingli in Switzerland, and you had Calvin. Yeah, Sophie.
And you had Sophie crying. So Sophie doesn't like talking about Martin Luther, I think.
Oh, she's stuck underneath the bench.
Oh, boy. But yeah, I mean, it's true. And you see why. I mean, when you had Christendom and you had a certain set of morals and rules, people followed them, not just because they were obliged to, because it was part of their religion and part of their faith, but because they wanted to go to heaven. And unfortunately, with this revolution, it really split that in half and changed a lot. Now, there was, of course, the Counter-Reformation, which was a beautiful time in church history, and it led to the Council of Trent. You had the great Pope St. Pius V, You had many great saints, St. Charles Borromeo, St. Ignatius of Loyola, who really fought very strongly against the Protestant Reformation. You had St. Thomas More, St. John Fisher. So you had a lot of saints in this era, but unfortunately, the changes had already struck. So after St. Pius V, there were no popes canonized as a saint until Pope Pius X. At least I believe that's true. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure from the mid 1500s, Pope Pius V, there were no saintly popes until Pope Pius X in the early 20th century. And that just shows you, I think, again, that even though the Counter-Reformation did a lot of good, the Council of Trent really set a lot of what we believe today, even though obviously it did not change from the traditions of the Catholic faith, but it helped to not establish, it helped to balance, to protect the Catholic faith from outside and from within. You still saw the real change that it had made on the world. And then you saw a couple hundred years later, of course, the real revolutions in America and in France, which led to the modernism which we know today. And I think that many people would agree that all of this started with Martin Luther and the idea that it's all good. All you have to do is have faith, and it's good enough. And I think that the world has never been the same since.
That's right. Yeah. And you really can see how morality changed around his ideas. And there's a quote where Luther says that a lie can be a good thing, even it can be indeed a virtue. And this goes back because there was this Prince Philip of Hesse, who was married with 7 children, and he asked Luther if he could marry one more woman, and this woman was a very young girl. And Luther answers him that it would be okay, but not in public, as it would unleash a great scandal. And so as thy spiritual guide, I advise you to join in this matrimony in secret.
Crazy, right?
Yeah, and actually later on it actually was discovered, and it did lead to a great scandal. And so Luther told him to deny everything, and that a lie in the name of God and in defense of the gospel, well, the true gospel, is not a sin.
Okay, we apologize to anyone for the little bit of noise in the background. This is the issue when a husband and wife try to do a show together. It makes for a little bit of a mess sometimes, but so apologize for that. Our daughter just wanted to have her voice heard in today's episode because she has very strong feelings as well about Martin Luther. To wrap up, I think we'll probably try to end the show here in the next few minutes. I think it needs to be said that his death was not a good one. Shortly before he died, he said, quote, "I will have myself eaten by the worms soon. They will get a fat doctor. We old people have to die."
And he was only 63 at the time, actually.
Exactly. And then he said, and again, this is crude, and I apologize to the sensitive audience, but he said, quote, "We have to look the devil in the arse. I looked the devil in the arse." He shortly died thereafter. It's pretty questionable how he died, but one of his servants did say that he was found with a noose around his neck and hung to death. Now, I don't know if that's because he committed suicide or someone killed him. No one really knows. It's a pretty questionable death for Martin Luther. At the funeral, you had many professors and probably former priests and monks, and they attested that his coffin was so it had such a strong stench coming through it, they could barely even stand being around it, even though it was a sealed metal coffin. And so I think you saw a little bit of the evil seeping through, and I guess also maybe the 7 liters of wine per day had finally caught up with Martin Luther. And I think that it just shows the end to a man that was in no way a good man. I cannot imagine how, after watching this movie, the Catholic Martin Luther and the Protestant Revolution, if you watch this, I cannot imagine how you could come away thinking that Luther was in any way a good man or a man that you would want to follow in any possible way. His religion was set up just to protest the Catholic Church and to make it possible for him to sin freely and to make others be able to sin freely. When that is one of the major tenets of your faith, to sin, to do things that you know are wrong. If you're saying that it is sin, then you know it is bad. And Luther was okay with that. He said to do it and do it a lot, do it as much as you possibly can, but just, have faith in God. And we see the kind of the ridiculousness of this, I think. And I think, unfortunately, Protestants today don't really know that. They don't really know where their religion came from. At least I hope not, because if they did, I surely hope they would not still be Protestants.
Right. Yeah, and I think that the really crazy contradictory thing is too that Luther, who was a denier of human freedom, you look at his works in the Bondage of the Will, he becomes pretty much the founder of modern freedom.
Right, exactly. And again, you see, and I think this is really similar to how you see things like the theory of evolution by Darwin, that these things are really grabbed by the people who want to control the world. If it's kings or queens or emperors, or if it's Bill Gates, whoever it is, they find a way to control the people because people are easily controlled. We all are. We all have the tendency to follow the crowd. And as Catholics, of course, that's something that we have to stand strongly against. We follow God. We follow God through the Catholic Church. And that sets us apart. That gives us this guideline. That gives us this way to know we are still on the right path. Because if we follow society, well, look at society, for goodness sake. It's a total disaster. The things that the Protestant, faith has brought into the world include contraception and abortion, at least in the United States. I guess that's not speaking for the rest of the world, but in the United States, they were directly related to both of those evils. And in that being the case, again, I just don't understand how you can feel like this is the religion that you think will get you to heaven. Anyone listening to this show, I'm fully convinced, want to go to heaven. If that's the case, then maybe dig into this and try to find what is really true. Why did Martin Luther find his own religion? Why did he go against the Catholic faith? And maybe try to find, why is the Catholic faith the truth, and why is the Protestant religion not?
Right. And I think when you convert from Protestantism to Catholicism, you're really gaining a lot. And I mean, that's at least how my mom always put it, who is a convert, when she met my dad. And yeah, when it is, Luther's faith really negates a lot of things. Like it negates the transubstantiation. He wants to get rid of Our Lady, of the church, of the mass. When you read his writings, he's so full of hatred against all this, against hatred of the mass. And he admitted that for his critique on the Holy Mass, as one of his writings, that the devil was his theology professor. And
Crazy.
He said that himself.
Right. And I mean, which isn't surprising because he said God had to become the devil in order to be God. Right. And again, if you just listen to his quotes, this guy was unhinged. I mean, I can't even say more about Luther, honestly. Just please watch this movie. And I would also like to note that this film, the Luther and the Protestant Revolution, was made by I think Novus Ordo Catholics. I think that's pretty clear. But in the end, they do come to the conclusion and say several times throughout the film that the Novus Ordo Church is clearly accepting Luther and accepting what Luther taught and embracing it. Bergoglio, as many people know to be Pope Francis, who we clearly believe to not be the Pope because he is clearly a heretic and apostate, he has said many positive things about Luther. And you could even find a couple of years ago, I think it must have been 2017 or 18, you could find statues of Luther in Catholic churches, even though,
I remember we saw one when we looked at a church, right?
Exactly.
And
right.
In my hometown. Yeah. And,
right.
And so, it had a plaque underneath, and it said, "One of us."
Exactly. And so you see, the Catholic Church obviously has nothing to do with Martin Luther. He was excommunicated, and clearly he teaches almost everything against what the Catholic Church teaches. So it shows you the Novus Ordo Church cannot be the Catholic Church. In fact, the Novus Ordo, which was created during the Vatican II Council in the 1960s, was heavily influenced by Protestants. And there were several quotes by Annibale Bugnini and others that say that they were creating changes in order to get closer to our Protestant brethren. And if you consider that, after hearing all of this story about Martin Luther and Lutheranism, I think it should absolutely be clear to you that if there is a church that calls itself the Catholic Church that is trying to unite with a religion that is clearly antithetical to everything you believe in, that church cannot be the Catholic Church. And I think that's how I would like to end the show. Ina, do you have any last comments before we go?
No, that was excellently summed up. Maybe Sophia has any last comments.
she always does. Thank you, Sophia. All right. Well, Ina, thank you very much for coming on. Again, I will link to that movie in the show notes. Thank you for listening. If anyone has any topics you would like us to talk about or to approach, movies, books, etc., please comment on this video or email me at kevin89davis@gmail.com. If you'd like to support this show, go ahead over to Patreon or PayPal. Those links are also found in the show notes. Thank you all very much. Ina, thank you again, and God bless. I'll see you here in the next 5 seconds or so.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
You've been listening to the Catholic Family Podcast. If you enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends and family. You can support the production on Patreon and PayPal, and you can reach Kevin at kevin89davis@gmail.com. Ad maiorem Dei gloriam. All for the greater glory of God.